Welcome, fellow horror hounds, and welcome to the latest episode of Talk and Stalk, your own holy home for horror. I'm your host, as always, Barry, and today's podcast is devoted to a slasher movie released in 1981. Now, this is actually, I feel, one of the most popular slasher films of the era. This is a slasher movie that certainly does have an ardent fan base. Now, as I said, it was released in 1981, which was an incredibly busy year for slasher films. It's probably the greatest year in the history of slasher movies. In 1981, we had a couple of sequels with Halloween 2 and Friday the 13th Part 2. We had films like My Bloody Valentine, Happy Birthday to Me, Graduation Day, The Funhouse, The Prowler, otherwise known as Rosemary's Killer, Hell Night, and of course, The Burning. Slasher movies, certainly at this point, were being churned out left, right, and centre, and The Burning is one of the best of these films, in my opinion. Now, The Burning is a slasher movie I really like. I probably don't love it as much as maybe some people, but this is certainly one of my favourite slasher films that was actually released during the Golden Age. This was actually a Miramax film. It was actually directed by a British director, Tony Maylam. And this was notable. This film actually launched the careers of Harvey and Bob Weinstein. Now, less said about Harvey Weinstein, the better. We're not really going to go into that. But this was actually his first movie as a producer. And, you know, as I said, slasher films were being released left, right, and centre at this point. And Friday the 13th just came out the year before. And this is another campsite slasher movie. And there was quite a slew of campsite slasher films that actually followed in the footsteps of Friday the 13th. You know, there was Sleepaway Camp in 83. There was also Cheerleader Camp. And, you know, it was clear that there was a fan base for these movies. And The Burning is one of the best examples of an early 80s slasher movie. You know, I think at its core as well is that the actual concept of the film was actually based, I think, on a campfire story that was told at summer camps kind of in and around New Jersey and New York. It was a very kind of popular campfire tale that was, certainly making its rounds, etc. And that's what this movie is essentially a telling of. And, the story is still very much in circulation now, and it actually formed the basis for a documentary, which is actually a great documentary that I would actually recommend people to watch. Called Cropsey, that was actually released back in 2009. Now, the ironic thing is, I think this movie was actually written before Friday the 13th, in fact. But this film was actually released the year after. This movie actually boasts some of Tom Savini's best practical effects, in my opinion. Tom Savini actually passed up the opportunity to do the effects for Friday the 13th Part 2 and actually took on The Burning instead. Friday the 13th, of course, was a success for Paramount. That film was actually the first slasher movie to be backed by a major studio. But no, he actually took on The Burning. And I think this film is... What The Burning has is it does boast some great practical effects. Okay, this is one of the gorier slasher films of the era. This is a film that it has a pretty high body count, but the majority of this film actually, what I think, one good aspect of this movie is that this movie actually has likable characters. I feel like there's an air of likability to a lot of the characters in this movie. Glazer, played by Jason Alexander. This was his first ever film role. And of course, Jason Alexander went on to have, quite a career. Most famous, of course, for, the hugely successful Seinfeld. And of Holly Hunter. Holly Hunter's in this film. In what's little more than a glorified cameo. She's a camp counselor. sorry, she's one of the teens at the camp and that. And she has a few appearances on screen and that. But she's basically kind of a glorified cameo, but this was her very first film. Fisher Stevens actually made his film debut in this movie as well. So this actually catapulted a few people. I mean, Holly Hunter has actually said that her role in this film was basically, little more than a cameo. But she was getting like $1,000 a day or a week or something. And, it helped her. It helped her, pay bills, etc. It helped her, put food on the table, and she made good friends whilst filming. Now, as I said, there's an air of likability with the characters in this movie. We actually get to spend quite a lot of time with the characters in this film, doing what you'd expect these people to do at a camp. They're fooling about. Some of the guys are chasing the girls. They're having a boat race. They're playing baseball. There's a very kind of naturalistic feel to it in this movie. I mean, even the bullyish character in Glazer, I still find there's an air of likability to him. He's a bit of a dick, certainly, but there's still an air of likability to him. I mean, there's a scene in the film where he's constantly trying to chase this woman, and he ends up, getting some, so to speak, and, a bit of premature ejaculation, what no man wants or anything, or a woman. And I can't help but feel sorry for him. He promises it's going to be better next time in that. And, we get the character of Alfred in this film, who's kind of, in a way, the lead character, if you will. He actually sees Cropsey, not too far into the film. And, he's... This is the thing with Glazer. Glazer's the bullyish character. But Alfred is a bit of a strange character, I find, in this movie. He's a bit... I mean, for example, he's perving on one of the girls in the shower, which is kind of a false scare kind of scene. And that's what this film does, actually. There's certain scenes in this movie that provide what you'd say false scares, false kills. There's the shower scene where you obviously think that the killer's going to creep up on her. There's a bit quite early on in the film with where they're playing baseball and the girl's looking for the ball. And of course we get the point of view, which has obviously become a huge staple in slasher movies, of Cropsey watching her. Is she going to be a victim? And then, of course, Woodstock going to the cabin. I can't recall what he's looking for now. And then, of course, somebody goes into the cabin and we assume that he's going to get killed. The movie utilises a few of them kind of false deaths, if you will. But we actually get to spend a considerable amount of time with the characters in this movie. And getting back to the character of Alfred, perving on the girl in the shower. And I think Glazer makes a point, don't be so hard on me. He's the one being a creep, perving on this girl in the shower. He does actually make a bit of a valid point. Alfred also as well, which is quite notable for this film. There's actually quite a few survivors in this movie as well. And what's even more notable is that in the vast majority of these movies, of these slasher films, we typically get a final girl. Usually it's down to one girl to kind of save the day, face off against the killer. In this movie, there isn't actually a final girl. Alfred, if anything, is kind of the final girl of the film. Where I'm kind of struggling to think of another slasher movie that actually has a male lead where he's actually one. Now, admittedly, he has a lot of assistance at the end of the movie, but there isn't actually a final girl in this movie. Now, this is a movie that actually caused quite a bit of controversy upon release. This was actually one of the earliest films to ever be deemed to actually get onto the UK Video Nasty list. This film was, yes, it caused quite a stir. As I said, this film is actually, when the kills do actually happen, they're brutal. They are brutal. As I said, boast, great practical effects by Tom Savini. There's one scene in particular that anyone that's a fan of this movie will talk about. You know, the one film that everyone talks about. And I firmly believe that it was this scene, really, that kind of got this movie on the UK Video Nasty list. And that is the raft scene, which really kind of comes out of nowhere. The raft scene it's brutal, it's hardcore, and it's quite rare, because rarely ever do we see 5 people killed all in one scene in a slasher film. They're literally all butchered one by one in this one scene that, as I said, I'm sure upon release was pretty much unexpected. Cropsey jumps up, comes out of this boat and kills 5 characters, just offs them quickly and brutally. It's a hell of a scene. And there's actually a scene, Cropsey's first murder in the film as well, actually killing a prostitute, which, again, you typically don't see in most slasher films. Because it doesn't start off, well, the flashback, the beginning of the movie, the summer camp, and then, of course, Camp Blackfoot, and then it actually goes to the hospital. And I kind of like the little build-up it actually has, that we hear this guy talking to this new guy in the hospital, and he's actually telling him about this guy that's lying there. He's burnt to a crisp. I've never seen anything like this, in the years of working here. And there's that kind of build-up. We don't get a look at Cropsey. We just kind of have to go on this guy's reaction as to what Cropsey looks like. And, that you don't actually see that much of Cropsey in this film. And I like that fact. I actually quite like that. I'm kind of a less is more kind of person. And, we do get to see Cropsey near the end of the film. There is actually kind of a little moment there where we do quickly get to see him when Alfred actually spots him outside the window, but it's literally like a couple of seconds, if that. Now, I know that Tom Savini wasn't actually happy with Cropsey's burn makeup in this movie, because apparently he was pretty much rushed to do it. He had 3 days to actually come up with the burn makeup, and I know he wasn't too happy with it. I personally think it looks good. I quite like the look of Cropsey in this film, and to me, Cropsey is definitely one of the best one-time slasher villains. Because obviously The Burning is a movie that never had a sequel, much like My Bloody Valentine. Great slasher movie. My Bloody Valentine is probably my favourite slasher movie of 81, in fact. But The Burning, I wouldn't actually put a million miles behind it. So I think Cropsey is even though we don't get to see much, a pretty memorable villain for the fact of using garden shears as well, which certainly at that time was a pretty unique weapon, and, being a staple of slasher movies and that, as I said, we get plenty of POV shots in this film, and the POV shots are actually very kind of distorted, actually. And from what I know, the cinematographer had actually rubbed a Vaseline on the lens to kind of give it that very distorted, kind of surrealistic look, through Cropsey's eyes. But as I said, the characters in this film are just likable. And the fact that we actually get to spend quite a bit of time with them, and Rick Wakeman's score in this film, I think, is good. And I do believe he actually decided to take an actual fee as opposed to profits and so forth. I don't think The Burning was ever really envisioned to be a success. I think there was some hope for it, with the success of Friday the 13th, etc. But from what I know, when The Burning was released in 81, it actually became the most successful horror movie in Japan, shockingly. But yeah, it did. The climax of the movie as well. We get that kind of, certainly I feel, a nod to Friday the 13th. That kind of jump scare kind of ending where, Crops is believed to be dead. I mean, we now know that the killer's not dead. These guys are almost impossible to kill, as Randy said in Scream, this is the moment when the supposedly dead killer comes back to life for one last scare. Cropsey, in a jump scene, in a jump scare moment, comes back at the end and then obviously, gets a weapon to the head. But The Burning never actually had a sequel. It's one of them good kind of standalone slasher flicks. And from what I know, the climax was actually shot at the ruins of an abandoned copper mine. I actually really do like the setting at the end of this movie. And I think originally it was to be actually filmed in a cave. That was the original plan. But the problem they had that proved to be way too much of a challenge was the cave was just full of bats. They couldn't seem to get rid of the bats. But from what I remember reading as well is that filming in this copper mine proved to be a bit of a challenge as well, because apparently even weeks later they were still coughing up the dust that they'd all kind of accumulated in their lungs, filming in that location. I think with The Burning, I think The Burning is definitely one of the best slasher films of its era. You could say it's one of them films that it's pretty slowly paced. There are definitely some satisfying brutal kills in that, but the kills kind of come few and far between. But I quite like that aspect of it, to be honest. As I said, because I feel like if this film had characters that you could really care less about, then yeah, I'd certainly have some issues with it. But it's the fact that these characters are actually likable. It is actually kind of a believable. I just love the whole kind of, there's nothing kind of manufactured about it. All of these characters are doing things you'd expect these people to be doing, in such a location. And the opening of this film as well, I think is really good. That really kind of sets the tone for this movie. Of course, like so many slasher films, it's essentially a revenge tale, if you will. But ironically, the teens that don't actually burn Cropsey, they don't actually get killed. The ones that do actually burn him don't actually get their comeuppance or whatever. But it's a prank. It's a prank gone wrong, much like in Terror Train. Obviously Kenny gets institutionalized. But from what we understand, even at the beginning of this movie, Cropsey's a bit of a dick. He's apparently not a very likable guy and a bit of a sadist. So that's why they're pulling this prank on the guy. Probably the wrong person to be pulling a prank on, but hell, you wouldn't have the movie. So obviously they use this head and, they wake him up and there's worms and all that. And obviously he ends up catching fire. And I think it's a great opening that really kind of sets the film up very well. I have kind of a soft spot for these kind of slasher films. I like the whole campsite setting. Friday the 13th is probably still my favourite campsite slasher film, but The Burning is very, very closely behind it. I think what I like with Friday the 13th, actually, of course that film has some memorable kills. Again, courtesy of Tom Savini, who did a great job in that movie, is the kind of anonymity of the killer, the fact that the killer is a mystery. It's not really revealed until the final act as to who the killer is, being Mrs. Voorhees, Pamela. I feel like when you first watch Friday the 13th, probably when it was released in 1980, you'd probably suspect that one of the teens, in fact, was the killer. But I like that whole kind of reveal and, Mrs. Voorhees. But The Burning is definitely, without a doubt, my second favourite all-time campsite slasher movie. Great practical effects, memorable characters, a cool killer, if you will, in Cropsey. I mean, the raft scene alone is worth watching this film for. It's just... You don't get scenes like that too often in slasher movies where so many people are killed off in one single scene. And again, it kind of stands out because it doesn't actually have a final girl, whereas 99% of slasher movies do. So I think this is a film that certainly played kind of an important part within that time of slasher movies. Yes, it clearly follows in the footsteps of Friday the 13th. It's another campsite slasher film, but it's one of the best. It's one of the very best of its kind. So, I think that's pretty much all I really wanted to talk about today. I will just say again, with this movie, another scene I think that was censored, actually, for the UK market. Now, I actually had this film on DVD and it had been censored, is The Murder of the Prostitute, which has got a really kind of sleazy feel to it. It's very brutal. Obviously, Cropsey uses a pair of scissors before he starts using the shears. I think, it feels like there's a little giallo kind of nod there as well, where she's kind of smashed through the window. For anyone that's a Dario Argento fan, they know that very much kind of a staple in many of his films, be it Tenebrae or Deep Red. It happens in The Murder of the Prostitute. Now, that is a scene that was actually trimmed in the UK on DVD, as of course the Raft Scene. I mean, we actually get that moment where Woodstock, who's actually one of my favourite characters in the movie, Fisher Stevens, where he actually gets his fingers just chopped off by them garden shears. It's like, what the hell? It's brutal. So, that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about today. So, thanks to everyone that listened. If you've liked what you've heard, please feel free to subscribe to my channel, which is Talk and Stalk. I also have a friend, Matt Nemeth, who's also a fellow podcaster. You can catch film and TV reviews and even Man United podcasts on his website, which is entertainmenttalk.org. And I have a fellow friend who's actually a YouTuber who specialises in short horror films, and he does stop motion short films as well. Dean Mallison Films, that's Mallison, and Dean Mallison Stop Motions. So they're worth checking out. So thanks a lot to everyone that listened, and I'll be back again soon. Take care.